Buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon, everyone.
¿Por qué mueren los niños?
Why do children die? 25 years ago, Bill Gates became obsessed with answering that question, and he was right. In 2010, about 10% of children under the age of 5 were dying. And we knew where that was happening and why. Where? In middle and low-income countries. And why? They were dying from communicable diseases because of contagious diseases. That means that 82% of those deaths could have been avoided. Not only did we know where and why this was happening, but we also knew what the solution was. Some of those solutions had already been invented, but there were problems with access. They were either too costly or those programs weren't being delivered where needed. Here, for example, we have oral hydration solutions against diarrhea, but there were solutions that had not yet been invented. And here, scientists began to work on that. That is the case of a vaccine against rotavirus. And what was accomplished? In less than 30 years, it was possible to reduce child mortality by 1/2. And now let me talk about another global challenge, and that is learning. Last year, OECD in December published the PISA results for 2022. And what those results revealed was a global crisis in learning. And what happened in Latin America? In Latin America, what we saw was that 3 out of every 4 children did not have fundamental skills in math, and about 1/2 of the children did not understand the text that they were reading. These were 15-year-old students. If learning were a disease, we would be talking about a global pandemic. And this is why, alongside with the World Bank, we decided to publish this report. This report comes out today, and it's called Learning Cannot Wait, so as to better understand what are the reasons behind this learning crisis in Latin America. And just like for child mortality, we knew where, and we also knew the why. Where? If you look at this slide, here on the left in red, you can see the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. On average, 15-year-old students in the region have 5 years of delay compared to average students in OECD countries. Now, if we compare Latin America with the countries that are on the right of this graph, the countries in green, they are above the average in OECD countries. You can see the delay, something like 10 years delay compared across these rankings. Now, not only do we know where the crisis of learning is located, not only do we know where the learning challenges exist, but we also know in countries exactly where those students that are lagging behind are to be found. Here you can see the poorly performing students in math. In brown, you can see high-income students. And what we can see is that 88% of the low-income students have poor performance compared to 55% of their rich peers. In other words, there is a difference of more than 30 percentage points between the two groups. Not only do we know where this is happening, but we know why. Here, first of all, we are not investing enough in education. What we can see here on this chart is that the countries in region, in red, are situated are on the tail of the distribution curve. But not only are we not investing enough, but there is a relationship between investment and learning, as we can see here on the chart. The third point that I wanted to make is when we look at the trend line, what we see is that the countries in the region are below that trend line. that means that there is a problem that has to do with efficiency. That means that the countries could be accomplishing more per dollar invested in terms of the learning that actually occurs. Also, there is a problem with investment, the amount. There's a problem related to efficiency, a distribution problem, that means equity, and the main input for educational systems in terms of functioning and producing learning is teachers. And what we see is this major input is distributed unequally. So the teachers, the best teachers, systematically, and we see this across all countries, systematically, they are in the schools where the highest income students study. Now, just like child mortality, we know exactly where and why, but we also know that there's a solution. We know what the solutions are. Number one, and this is absolutely essential, we have to measure, and we have to measure more, and we have to measure better. We have to measure our learning clearly. So by measuring learning, we know where we stand. Also, we get a sense of direction, and in this way, we can decide where we want to head in the next few years. We have to invest more. The countries in the region are not investing enough in education, but also we have to invest better. Investing better means we have to generate efficiency, we have to spend better, but it also means that we have to invest in the programs that we know are truly effective, in programs that make a difference in terms of learning. We know, for example, that if we offer small children right from the earliest ages good literacy programs, we are able to increase by 30% the reading skills of these children. We also know that when we provide a cultural context to learning math, indigenous children can develop 50% more skills in math. We also know that when we provide tutoring to the most vulnerable students, those that have fallen the most behind, and these techniques are not all that costly, we are able to improve those students' learning by 30%. And we know that if we increase school attendance by providing feeding programs, we know that that increases attendance by 9%. And lastly, data. Data. That is essential. We need to have information management systems. Not only will these systems create greater efficiency, but also it's a matter of equity. Thanks to the systems, thanks to data, we will be able to better distribute and distribute more equitably the resources in the educational system so as to make up for those differences that may exist from birth. Now, we're acquainted with the magnitude of the problem. We have studied in detail the report being published today with the World Bank. We know who is not learning, and we want to face that challenge. But when we look at the solutions, we have to see what is effective. We have done this before. We've done this already. We can do it again. Now, the main challenge is how can we accomplish this, but take it to scale so that we can transform educational systems throughout the region. Because education cannot wait. Learning cannot wait. These generations, the generations here in this picture, these young people, these children, cannot wait. And that is precisely our topic for the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mercedes. Mercedes highlighted three key points. So the situation of learning in the region is really low, it's very low. It also highlighted that, on average, the investment in education is low, although there are differences across countries. And the third point is actually, with what we invest currently in education, we can get much better results. So it seems like a depressing scenario. But I like the way Mercedes ended up his presentation with hope. And the first round of questions, very short answer from the panelists, is whether you also see hope for the region. Why don't we start with Marsha first?
It is very important when you make change to make it from a data-driven perspective, and the PISA results of 2022 has given Jamaica a basis from which to make targeted changes, so it's hopeful for us.
Ministro Noghi.
I think the question is not whether we can, rather we need to do that. So this is why I think our discussion is relevant. We've been talking about generations in countries, development in countries, and how we integrate with the world. Education is the cornerstone of Costa Rica's positioning in the international context as a country with high standards against a backdrop of a region that is struggling to improve its position. Ursula? I do also agree that we need to be hopeful, and I believe that in Brazil, despite the many difficulties involved in the COVID-19 crisis, we have made changes in the system to finance education, and this seems to be quite ambitious, full of good ideas, and we are offering more courses and more targeted as well in terms of the inequalities between and among schools, in addition to the links between the state and local government levels. This is also changing by offering more funds to local governments with a view to improving management and inequalities in education among different students. And we are also applying rules. And we now also have a foundation with a focus not only on efficiency, but on reducing inequalities, which is key in some of our countries. Thank you, Fernando. I don't just think there is hope, but we must also internalize the magnitude of the challenge we face. The crisis is so great, and Mercedes explained it very well. The primary challenge is to be aware of the extent of the crisis. But there is hope. First, because we know what to do, and Mercedes has illustrated this, all of the topics we can deal with. And it's not rocket science. It's not impossible. And many countries and regions, even in Latin America, have made progress. Ceará, Mendoza province in Argentina, Bogotá, and Barranquilla, with the reading skills program. What we need to do, and this is crucial here, is the political commitment, because we know what to do, but we need to do it to scale. That is the major challenge, and this requires the commitment of ministers of finance, of education, of prime ministers, congresses, and societies as a whole. I think therein lies the challenge.
It's no nuclear physics, but I'm very lucky to be accompanied today by this panel where we have Minister of Finance, Minister of Education, experts. They actually work on the two sides, both in education and in finance. And in this panel, the first rule of the game is going to be a panel in 3 languages: Portuguese, Spanish, and English. So if you have time, grab some of the automatic translator. The second rule of the game, you are free to say whatever you want, but there is time and the timekeeper, and I'm going to be very strict with that. The last rule of the game is that if you disagree with whatever is said by other panelists, feel free to intervene. I'm going to be very strict on time. So we're going to talk today about solution to increase learning and how to fund this solution. We're going to start first talking about solution. So, Marsha, the ball back to you. Could you share some short and medium-term intervention that have been successful, actually, in improving learnings?
Yes, in Jamaica, immediately on the onset of COVID, we had to reposition how we engage our students. And one of the things we did in 2022 was yard to yard, where we actually went to find the students who had disengaged from school. And we were able to report that we had success and had restored learning attendance to pre-COVID levels. We also had a Recover Smarter initiative, which was targeted at summer schools for students who had learning loss, also homework program, where we also utilized the skills of our pre-trained teachers and final year teaching students at our teacher training institutions. We partnered with UNICEF also with a learning passport. This particular e-platform is targeted at literacy among primary level students. This is also rolled out to the entire Jamaica and has been successful. During the COVID months, our Prime Minister, and I'm happy to hear Jaime speak about the commitment of our politicians, our Prime Minister commissioned a report on education transformation. And coming out of that report, there were recommendations made to improve the education landscape in Jamaica, and we have a public education campaign called Trend, which is to sensitize the country about all the areas that require change, and that public education program has been an important part of the change management required to improve the educational outcomes.
Thank you, Marsha. Nogi, creo que es muy importante.
Dogi, I think it's very important for ministers of finance to reach consensus with ministries of education on the interventions to be implemented and how to implement them, don't you think? I'd like to hear your views. Yes, I think we need to separate three elements in the discussion. The first one is that, indeed, the pandemic did show a structural problem in education, an educational structure that was very cosmopolitan, concentrated around the main population centers, and then there's the periphery, and that's one problem to deal with. The second thing that the pandemic laid bare was the lack of coordination, the inability to provide the necessary tools so that access to a new kind of education could take place. And it also showcased something that should no longer exist. The history of education in Latin America focused on teaching students to read, to write, and to do arithmetic. But the sort of education that is needed today to really join a valuable labor market and to ensure that the country has more access and chances in terms of foreign investment, so as to have better management opportunities, that is lacking, and that needs to be financed. And that is the other side of the story that we also need to see. The pandemic also depleted public funds. The resources we have today are limited, and therefore the strategy or approach taken by Jamaica has to be in accordance with the capacity of the state, of government. And a slide we saw at the beginning was very interesting regarding the efficiency in terms of the use of resources. I think we really need to focus very well on what the main elements are in order to have better education on the basis of the resources we have, while being aware of how much more we need to invest to take that quantum leap. While I worked at the National Bank, there was a manager who used to say that the bank needed to take these quantum leaps because growing on an ongoing basis is quite easy. You don't need to do much. It's about taking these leaps. And I think Latin America needs that kind of leap to be able to meet new educational needs for youth in order to offer them more opportunities in an increasingly competitive world.
The two regional experts and global experts, could you complement what Marsha and Nogi have said? What do you think are the 2-3 very strongly evidence-based interventions that should we adapt and bring to scale in order to do this quantum jump? Jaime first, and then Mercedes.
You see, I think the core issues have been raised by Mercedes. I would sum this up into 3 points. First, as Mercedes said, we need to measure results. We need to be aware of the learning level of children all the time, and not just through PISA, which is an indicator. We also need censuses and assessments that will allow us to know on an ongoing basis what the learning levels of each of the children is, and thereby we will know what efforts need to be made to make sure that all of them learn. And in addition to all of the interventions highlighted by Mercedes, I'd say the main challenge is about the teachers, the human resource. We talk a lot about technology and infrastructure, and there are certainly many things that can be done, but nothing will improve unless we make sure we have the best possible human resources in education. And by that, I mean the micro and macro levels. The minister said we need to be more efficient. And efficiency is the best possible use of human resources. Efficiency means that spending or investment in teachers ensures that we select the best teachers, offering all of the skills to the professionals so they can do their job to standards of excellence, which means we need to ensure that the teaching career or professions are not politicized, so that the selection of teachers and professors will be based on merit. And this also relates to the management of the system. We do, in fact, need to come closer to the efficiency border, which means having the best possible human resources in the educational bureaucratic structures. And if you look at any given country, you will normally see that the first tendency seems to be to go towards the Ministry of Finance rather than to the social or educational portfolios, because providing educational services to millions of children every day is extremely difficult, and that requires highly qualified officials. If the officials and the structures are highly politicized, we'll never reach that. So we need a results-based approach and having the best resources in education.
Minister of Finance, we are actually discussing yesterday in the bus from the airport with some of the directors here, but I'm not going to mention who and the country, but exactly along that line. Mercedes.
Just quickly, so as not to repeat things, I think one thing I would go back to after what Jaime and Ursula said, this has to do with measurement. Brazil currently is undergoing a review process for its quality indicator. And I remember traveling to Amazonia and to Manaus, and when you entered the education ministry rooms where they did the educational planning, the Secretary for Education, I found it remarkable that on all boards, on all blackboards, there was a goal, an objective. They said, okay, we are number 14, and now we want to go up to number 3. That's the kind of effort, the kind of visualization that is needed. And you can only do that if you have an educational quality index, and you need to measure learning on an ongoing basis. Mendoza is trying to do something similar. That's the second point. And there's the link between the short and medium term. There are reforms that, as pointed out by Minister Nogi, will take many years. These are structural reforms. But today, in the educational system, we need to deliver responses to students that need to complete the school studies today and leave with skills for life and work. So we need to blend effective short-term interventions that will allow the students with the car we have today to learn, graduate, and effectively learn and leave school. But at the same time, we'll also have to work on the other reforms that will take longer, and as Jaime said, will include teachers and curricula, but that will require longer periods. But we need to offer solutions today to the students who are in the education system today. We can't say, hold on, this will take 5 years, come back in 5 years' time, and we'll solve the educational problems. I think Jaime wanted to add something. Let me just share an anecdote related to what Mercedes was saying. When I was across the counter and I was Minister of Education in my country, Peru, something happened to me so that when I wrote a book on management, I said, we were late. We are late. I called the book Estamos tarde, we're late. After something, a student in Churucanas, a small village in the north of Peru, he said to me, this was a full day schooling program. Many high schools still have 2 or 3 shifts in our country. And this is also the case in many other countries in Latin America. And in his school, we had changed this to a full day schooling arrangement. And I would ask the students what they thought about attending classes on a full day basis. And everyone, the parents, the kids, were all happy. But this boy, this was a boy in the last year of high school, he raised his hand and somewhat cynically, he said, this is fine, but this is fine for those in the first year of high school. I'm in 5th year and I'm leaving. For me, you've come too late. It's too late. And I had no answer for him. Yes, in fact, we were late for that young boy. No one will give him back the 5 years he spent in a poor quality high school. This is why what Marcel said is so important. Although there are changes that do take time, as we speak, there are children and students in classrooms and they need better services.
The issue of financing and financing a better way to get more impact for the money we're putting in the system. And I really would like to invite Ursula to talk a little bit of what's happening in Brazil and her thoughts about this. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a fundamental issue. And as we've said, we've been undergoing reforms. In the last 20 years, we set up a fund at the 3 levels, so state, federal, and local government. And this provides for resources for basic education. And this change is underway, and the federal government will be doubling resources by 2026. This was a process that involved a lot of discussion. Will be going up to 23%. And it's not just about the number of students. We're also taking into account the inequalities that exist between different institutions while seeking to build indicators that will also take into account inequalities in terms of race, gender, and socioeconomically. The idea is to make adjustments in terms of the needs and to allocate resources accordingly. So the idea is to enhance equality through management, through better management, reviewing the inequalities as well. It's a complex process, but we think that is a possible path for change in the coming years. One thing that requires a solution is related to the fact that all of the resources that come from the taxes. And of course, the economy grows and revenue will grow as well. There is more revenue in good times, but when there's a crisis, when you need funds the most, then cuts are made. So that is something that needs to be changed in the medium term. We don't want education to get caught up in those ups and downs. So a tax reform that is more targeted in terms of revenue and wealth would be the best way to guarantee the continuity of policies across governments by better management of resources. And that is a process that is underway and will continue over the next few years. We don't have federal transfers in Costa Rica, but we know the primary concern is, of course, to achieve greater impact, right? Yes, in Costa Rica, the budget of the Ministry of Public Education, you see, we have a universal system, graduate education is free of charge and mandatory. And after paying interest, which is the greatest challenge, after having become indebted so highly, how do we manage the social expenditure side of things? And so we allocate to the public education ministry 5.1%, 5.2% of GDP actually, and that is a whole lot of money. The question is, how are we going to ensure that all of these challenges presented here today are actually met with finance? Offering access to technology is not just about giving out computers. We need to invest in all of the infrastructure to create the required bandwidth. We need to provide electricity to rural areas and elsewhere to ensure access to the technologies. So it's not just about the budget as such or about introducing a tax. There's a lot more to it than just the budget that goes to education. It's about how we create the whole surrounding infrastructure, and that may well be the key challenge. And my concern in Costa Rica is what sort of education we need to offer students. We're already well into the 21st century, and well, you were talking about having been late. Today's decisions have to focus on the short term as well. We need to know what we're going to do, but the decision going forward places or poses a number of significant challenges for the government that are not only linked to education. We've talked here about teachers, we've talked about feeding the children, we've talked about more appropriate settings for education, but if access to public infrastructure is lacking, if you don't have the roads that allow students to reach educational institutions, it won't be that easy. So the challenge is for the country as a whole. The discussion of spending in the educational field has to look at all of the required conditions for education to be imparted. And our countries need to first think about the education in terms of what sort of education, what sort of conditions are being required. Interestingly, unlike many countries in Latin America, in Costa Rica, the challenge is that we will have fewer and fewer students in the educational system. And that means that the children will have to support many older adults and will have to create the necessary conditions. What education will that student need to be productive enough to then support older people in our country? And that requires that we start thinking a bit about the idea that it's not just about spending or about the public education ministry budget. It's about the sort of expenditure, what sort of education we are aiming at, and what conditions are needed. And I think that may well be the main concern in a country like Costa Rica.
I would like to push the other three panelists maybe to complement a little bit, because I work a lot in health, and I think more or less, with some successes, some defeats, the concept of financing for results is a little bit more developed than in education. So how can we push financing schemes that are really oriented to results in education? Anyone wants to?
Yo creo que
I believe the first step is what has already been mentioned. We need to know where we are. We can't possibly sail blindly. We need to be aware of results, definitely. And that's something we don't have in the whole region. We don't know the exact results, not just at the country level, but at the individual school and child level. And secondly, there certainly does have to be an accountability approach, and teachers and school directors and managers need to know that they are where they are for children to learn. The terms of reference for a teacher are not about teaching. They're about ensuring that all of the children in the classroom learn, because I can teach, but you may not learn. And it's not just for me to wash my hands off it. We need to ensure that every child learns. We need a results-based rationale, and we also have to work on results-based budgeting so that every intervention is evidence-based. And I'd say that one of the key problems when you don't have enough evidence in the educational field, or you don't use it enough, has to do with in-classroom methods. There are many interventions that involve impact assessment, but we don't have that much in terms of methods for reading skill learning. And, you know, what is the right method? Is it the phonetic or global method? Many people have probably learned through the phonetics, yeah? And in many schools, it's no longer taught that way, and there isn't enough evidence or enough use of the evidence to pick the method that works. And that is very inexpensive and highly efficient. If we switch to the method that works, for which we have significant good evidence that it works, basically using the same resources for all practical purposes, we may have better results. And there's a link both to education and health. So there's a lot less information at that specific level, and that is needed.
Marcia, and then Mercedes?
Úrsula quería.
Ursula, and Nogi also raises that.
Despertaste a todo el mundo ahí.
Despertaste todo el mundo.
You roused everyone. Before going straight into the question, I just wanted to clarify when I talked about taxes, you know, the idea of creating new taxes, the wealth tax, the idea is that the tax reform should be more just, gradual, and it should enhance overall equity. That's the point I was aiming at. And as regards enhancing financing, I do agree that information systems are vital in order for us to be able to make progress in efficiency. In a country like Brazil, where the local government level is huge, we have over 5,000 municipalities, and within that model, seeking to reduce inequalities. If we don't have information systems to learn about the results and also learn about the differences in income and expenditure in each municipality, the potential, the shortcomings in each territory, that requires a high degree of coordination between the state level and the municipal level. And we'll also need to improve the information on inequalities among students, gender, race, socioeconomic, because that will make it easier to work. Because if we look at both ends, the ones who are more gifted and the ones who are more vulnerable, it doesn't work that way. Because we've, on average, advanced quite a bit in Brazil. But after the pandemic, there has been an increased difference in the inequalities between the most advantaged and the most vulnerable. We need to make sure that resources are used effectively, and we need to be highly effective with a view to achieving equity. We need to make sure that the resources are used effectively to reduce inequalities, and that's a main point to our
important point.
reform.
Maybe in the last question, I really would like to go back to the importance of the information system. Marcia.
What I want to share is that in Jamaica, as we seek to transform education, we are looking at financing as a management tool within our institutions and also at the ministry. What we are doing now is that KPMG is actually reviewing our financial management as a ministry to see what are the risk mitigations that we can employ and to get efficiencies. And also, In partnership with the IDB, we are looking at the financing within our institutions themselves by piloting for a program with 50 schools to get them a part of the government management framework. Accounting software has been provided, and it is expected that once we go through that pilot with our 50 schools, we'll be able to expand that project throughout all the schools to saturate, or not to saturate, to plug all the leakages that are happening within the resources. Because the thing about Jamaica is that education gets the second largest part of our budget outside of the Ministry of Finance. So it is our role as the education sector to be efficient with what we get.
Yeah, that's a very important point, Marsha. Nogi.
Sí, tal vez yo quería, señor.
I would just like to highlight something Jaime said. What are the measures we have to know whether we are having an impact in terms of education or not? Normally, we have data on the shares of children at a certain age in a school. The question is, how many effectively finish school, and what is the exit profile? So I think there should be a way to measure efficiency, because otherwise you're just looking at spending, how much you spend per student. And the question is, what is the productivity of the money spent per student? And that's where we need to work together for the purposes of that kind of management approach to public resources. The ministries of education and finance should work closer together to understand the dynamics. Our ministries of finance tend to be a bit more frugal in the use of resources than ministries of education. But it's an important topic, because the responsibility of the Ministry of Education is to create a basis for development. Education is the basis for development in countries, and I think that challenge is significant. The Ministry of Finance should also engage. It's not like parents who just put the money in and that is spent by children. It's something we need to understand, the why, the where, the what for of things. And I think that is important as part of this discussion, and I hope it's just the start of a process that will enable mutual support across ministries, mutual understanding. Mercedes.
Yes, regarding that point, I think that regarding the financing of the educational system, as Ferdinando was saying, there is dissonance between the ministers of education, the ministers of finance. The minister of education says, look, I need more money. And the minister of finance comes in and says, that's Nogi. He comes in and he says, well, first of all, justify this investment plan that you're presenting, because I think that perhaps you could create some efficiency in the system. I get the impression that there are some budget items that are not being implemented. And then what happens? The Minister of Education scratches his head and says, okay, how can I come up with estimates that the Minister of Finance is going to like? I'm not talking about results. I'm just talking about planning, projections of education. So the minister begins to look for data. He goes back to his ministry. And sometimes we don't have a list of information looking at students and schools. So how can we do educational planning if we don't have that basic data? And that is why we were talking about information management systems. That is absolutely essential for this purpose. Let's say that we have that information system in place, that we have all the data we need to make changes. So there we can begin to have the conversation on efficiencies. For example, we can do a lot of things. We can drop estimates of the best teaching program. What is the best program in the current context? What would we do year to year? Because the demographics in our countries are changing. Yesterday, I was talking to Nogi about this. We have 1 million students today, but in the next 30 years, we may have 1/2. We may have 1/3 of that number of students. So that's the type of conversation that needs to take place between the ministers of education and finance. And that is why data
I'll
is
leave
so
you the floor
key.
just a second. I know it was going to be very difficult to manage. People have a lot to contribute to the discussion of the sector. The second to the last question. I mean, we cannot do all this with paper and pencil. Okay, so I really, second to the last questions is regarding the role of technology and digitalization in all this. So I have two questions for you, for all of you. My request is to be as short as possible in the answers. So, is technology really key to improve learning going forward? And the second, and I think Mercedes already alluded to it, there is basically lost in translation between Minister of Education and Minister of Health. For example, if we were able to really develop at scale educational management system based on technology, those could be really a good space to foster a concrete, pragmatic conversation and dialogue between the Minister of Education and the Minister of Health. What do you think? So what is the role of technology, both for learning and management of the system? I don't know who wants to start now.
Let me start because I just quiero complement.
I wanted to add to what was just said by Minister Nogi on the importance of both ministries, at least the Ministry of Education and the Minister of Finance. They have to take part in that discussion on technology. First of all, education in some countries is 1/5 of the state, so you can move aggregate demand. And second, that determines productivity, and productivity in Latin America has been flat for something like 20 years. Nogi knows that better than I do. And to a great extent, that is due to education, the lack of investing in human capital in the region. And that's a problem that the ministers of finance, in part, it's their problem, but it's also a problem of the ministers of education. And that means that now, unfortunately, we need to invest at all levels of education. As Mercedes was saying, in this discussion between the Minister of Education and the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Finance says, I want you to prioritize. That's what he says to the Minister of Education. And he says, I cannot prioritize between early education and technical education because it's like saying, choose between two of my children, between your 17-year-old and your 5-year-old. I cannot prioritize. Oh, you have to prioritize between defense and education, but I cannot prioritize within education. So we have to give all children all tools. So I have to make good investment in early childhood and also in technical education. But what we do have to work on in the region is efficiency. For me, efficiency, the main things are data. Data for me to manage human resources well. 70% of the expenditure goes to payroll. And if you don't take as much from productivity out of your payroll, that means we're in problems. That means that we have to put the teachers where they need to be and make certain that they're doing their job well and that they are producing learning. And then regarding technology, technology is important for all of the information process, yes. Technology is important for the educational process, yes, but it will never replace teachers nor human resources. Technology can complement human resources. That is the key point. We in Latin America see a tragedy of inequality because in the same region, even in the same cities of Latin America, in some schools, we're talking about how to use Gen AI, how to use artificial intelligence. Here in one classroom in the same city, you have schools where children are not learning to read, and it's in the exact same city. We are in the 20th and the 21st century, and we're talking about what happens within cities where there is a lot of inequality, and that is being produced by technology, but technology offers the potential of reducing that inequality by supporting the work done by teachers in their classrooms. Now, here I was thinking about what was said about the need for there being an agreement between finance and education. Just imagine that in a country like Brazil, where we have 27 states many municipalities, each with its Secretary of Education, Secretary of Finance. So the discussion amongst those levels and between levels. So to understand the need of an agreement is absolutely essential, and I think that technology can help clarify and reduce asymmetries of information. If I have information on educational results for finance, and also if I have information on availability of resources for education. If education provides you with resources to do medium-term planning, and you have to know if you're going to have resources or need to cut back, it's easier to plan. And that problem, if you do not provide all the information for education, is important. So information technology helps both sides and established, agreed upon goals to work towards them. So here it's important that we look at the need to reduce inequalities. That is the main objective. Very quickly, I think that there are two levels where it's important to use technology. The first is how can we expand education to reach all sectors? And there we're going to have to look for mechanisms so as to be able to make certain that, for example, all schools have broadband. How can that be done? Because that inequality occurs not only in the area of education, but it also has to do with the speed. It's not only access. So I think that it's essential to include technology as an issue. I can share my experience with you. In the school attended by my children, I said, how can they not have the ability to learn how to use an Excel spreadsheet? It's so basic nowadays. And it's because there's no technology. Technology has to be there. And the second issue that I think is very important is all ministries of education are tremendously large. Without using technology, you're not going to have the necessary data to call for accountability in terms of resource management, but especially the abilities of children that are graduating, because the whole thing is how can I use technology so as to be able to understand what is actually happening? You were talking about 5,000 municipalities. How do you know children are doing in municipality 1 or in municipality 5,000? You have to use technology to find that information. And in the long run, all of this is a political decision. They are political decisions. What are you going to do? When are you going to do it? What resources will be using? So at the end of the day, you have to have technology to be certain of what we're doing.
Political issue. President Marsha, some tweets or?
Okay, very quickly. What I will agree that technology is very important to reducing the inequalities within our various societies. There is a digital divide, and technology has an important role to play also as an instructional aid, particularly with literacy and numeracy, to get to students who may have had learning loss. And I also think that technology is important as a national focus. And in Jamaica, we recently launched Digital Jamaica program, and this particular program, which seeks to expand broadband throughout the island, has particular emphasis and targeting on institutions and children's home, because at the end of the day, we need to ensure that there's a platform of access for our schools.
Rápido.
I think that technology necessarily has to be a part of any solution, either for management or for learning. What Jaime was describing is a situation where there is a structural problem of access. Access to technology is unequal. Some children have access to the third technological generation, and other children have no connectivity in their schoolroom. So there is a problem in terms of access to technology and how it's done. And you can't think of an educational system that is completely disconnected from the technology transformation that the world is experiencing. We aren't training people, students that are ready to belong to that digital world. So for me, it's impossible to think of any educational system thinking of management or the pedagogical side of the system that does not include technology. Technology offers great possibilities. We can amplify the impact of our intervention thanks to technology. 30 years ago, it was unthinkable in a classroom with 30 children. It's incredible to think that in that classroom you could personalize the learning process of those children. But now, with content platforms, adaptation, students can receive feedback in real time on what they're doing. And it is repeated once and again. And the teacher's role is to provide support to that learning process. The teacher supports the learning process because I agree with you. The human touch, the person, that relationship between the teacher and the student cannot be replaced. But thanks to technology, we can do things that were truly unthinkable before.
We are close to the end, and if there is any question from the audience, I'm going to take it. If you can wait.
El diálogo político. The political dialogue that can exist between the Secretariat of Education and the Secretariat of Finance. But these are challenges that, as the Costa Rican speaker said, shows the complexity of accessing education as a human right. But exactly what can we say about the ability to think critically? That is something that I cannot measure by looking merely at efficiency or results or the technological challenge. That's important, but if I, in an educational system, am not able to revolutionize going from banking literacy, how can I talk about inclusive education? So here I would like to hear your thoughts, because we did discuss the level of inequity and the complexity of the system, but Latin America is in a poor position. We want to compete, and sometimes we look at profitability, technological skills, but we forget the human being. Xiomara Mu is my name. Who would like to answer?
We really have, I know this is a complex question, we really have 2 minutes, so Nogi, and then maybe Mercedes and Jaime.
Sí, yo creo que nadie.
I think that no one overlooks the soft skills, the ability to think. The problem is that we need to strike a balance in education. Those young people with those soft skills will get ahead. The question is, are they going to have the necessary skills to be able to make a contribution to their country? And that is why it's so important to understand that investing in education is investing in the country. So here we're talking about a person that comes out with comprehensive knowledge. So that young person could be part of the world. My country, Costa Rica, Honduras, whatever country, that is the way we have to train our students. That was a very good question. Many educational systems in the region are currently reforming their curriculum by focusing on skills, competencies, and those are structural reforms. It takes time to implement them, to train teachers, etc. And those are reforms that point to the problem you were raising. How can we create a well-rounded individual, someone with a holistic education? So I think that there is development in countries in that direction. Now, referring to critical thought processes, and that is where we have the fundamental skills compiled with the more advanced skills of the 21st century. So first, a person learns to read. Then we read to learn. And once the person has acquired that knowledge, the person develops the skill, which is called critical thinking. But you cannot skip any of those phases in the process. Yes, let me add to what was just said. What we're failing to do in the region is that step one, that foundation of the building, which is to at least teach how to read. That should be universal. It is a human right. Everyone should be able to learn to read by the end of primary school, but that is not even being done. Now, we have to, in addition to that, have a system that can provide everything. Now, to have a system that can provide everything, we need good teachers, because to teach critical thinking, that is very difficult. So if I asked anyone, how do you teach your children to think critically? Can anyone provide me with an answer? That's very hard, and that is the role of the teacher. And that is why it's so important to make certain that we have excellent teachers, because they have a very hard job.
Thank you very much to all of you. I want to add the last question, which I'm not going to be able to do, which is to hear committee. We spoke about results. I want to listen to the IDB and the World Bank to commit to some movement of the PISA in 2025. You are lucky that we don't have space to answer, and also in countries. But maybe you can post your answer, what you expect for the PISA 2025 in your X and social media. Please, a big round of applause for the panel, and thank you very much.